The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Man from Lang. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, we are going to take a look at Hank Sampson, the survivor investigator who will be released in the Feast of Hemlock Vale Investigator expansion. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the patrons of this channel for their tremendous support. You all rock. If you'd like to be amazing like these people and support the channel's goals and see your name on this list, head over to patreon.com, sign up for a tier of your choice, and claim your rewards. That would be awesome. Special thanks to Cole Monroe Chitty, Nicole Fiscus, and Nate Lost in Time and Space for their contributions to the channel. I couldn't do it without you. Without further ado, let's get started. Hank Sampson is the farmhand. He has 3 willpower, 1 intellect, 5 combat, and 3 agility. The assistant and warden traits. You may be assigned damage and or horror dealt to ally assets or other investigators at your location. As a response, when you would be defeated by damage and or horror, instead heal all of your damage and horror and swap this card with its bonded resolute version, either side face up. His Elder Sign effect is very straightforward, just a +1, and he has 5 health and 5 sanity. Now, Hank is the 5th investigator in the game with 5 combat, the others being Daniela, Mark, and Nathaniel in the Guardian class, and Tony in the Rogue class. Hank does have the lowest health and sanity in the game, but he does resurrect himself after he goes down to defeat the first time, so he actually has a fairly sizable health and sanity pool for the encounter deck to chew through. Hank has average willpower, average agility, and above average combat, the only outlier being his below average intellect, which is pretty rough if you're planning to play Hank in solo. However, the survivor and neutral cards can mitigate the impact of having 1 intellect. You've got cards like Flashlight, for example, that can reduce the shroud value of locations. If you can reduce the shroud value to 0, Hank is almost guaranteed to get a card, barring an auto-fail token. The same goes for cards like the Old Keyring, and there's even more recent cards like the Pocket Multi-Tool that was released in the Scarlet Keys Investigator expansion. If you pick up Pocket Multi-Tool and upgrade it with the Magnifying Lens and Lucky Charm, then Hank is investigating at a 3. And then if he fails that investigate test, he gets to ready the Pocket Multi-Tool so he can try again. So there's all those cards, as well as, you know, traditional favorites like Lucky, Live and Learn, etc., to help Hank out. So 1 intellect doesn't look great, but there are a lot of ways to mitigate that issue. And Daniela, I believe, has the same intellect as Hank, and I have had some success playing her, so I suspect that Hank will probably do fine. Now, 5 sanity does make Hank an ideal candidate to leverage the Desperate skills that were originally released in the Echoes of the Past expansion, later reprinted in the Path to Carcosa Investigator expansion. If Hank picks up in the thick of it at the beginning of the game, he can hit himself with 2 trauma, dropping his sanity down to 3, which turns those Desperate skills on automatically. Hank should have a pretty good chance of picking up a clue if you play a card like Desperate Search. So he has a 5, you know, combine that with cards like Unexpected Courage and your typical Perception. And again, Hank's going to be in pretty good shape. I suspect that we will see a lot of Desperate Hank decks out there once he is released in January. Hank has a pretty interesting relationship with trauma. Now, if I have read the rules correctly, Hank cannot take 5 physical or mental trauma. That will cause him to be either killed or driven insane, so you don't want that. But if Hank, say, has 4 physical and or 4 mental trauma, he starts the game with those on his Investigator card, and then you only need to take 1 damage or horror to replace it with his bonded card. So if you really want his bonded card, that is one way of getting it quickly. The other nice thing about that is if you have taken a lot of trauma during the campaign, basically it is wiped clean as soon as Hank goes down for the first time. So unlike some investigators who will be sweating bullets if they have, say, a couple of mental trauma on them and only 5 sanity, Hank, rest assured he can just remove all that trauma and start fresh as soon as he goes down the first time. Now, Hank's bonded cards do beg the question, how quickly do you want Hank to die during a scenario so you get access to the abilities on those cards? The version of Hank that starts in play doesn't really have much of an ability, doesn't have very much in terms of abilities. I mean, you can soak damage for ally assets and other investigators, but that's about it. You don't get to draw cards or gain resources if you take damage and or horror. So a lot of players will probably want to get a new version of Hank as soon as possible. We do not know the deck building options for any of the investigators that have been spoiled for the Feast of Hemlock Vale Investigator expansion. We do have some pretty strong hints about what those deck building options may be. For example, Wilson Richards deals with tools, so he probably has access to tools in most, if not all, of the classes in the game. Kate Winthrop deals with science and tool assets. She probably has access to all the, at least all of the science assets in the game, if not tools as well. Alessandra deals with parlay actions. She probably has access to all the cards that have parlay actions on them. Now, I have been pretty bad at predicting what the deck building options are, but in the case of Hank Sampson, I think there's you can make a pretty strong case that he is at least part Guardian. Before Hank Sampson was spoiled, most players had Hank pegged as either a Guardian or a Survivor. Really, those are the only two classes that sort of fit for him. He's definitely not a Seeker. He's not a rogue, and he's definitely not a mystic. So Guardian and Survivor were really the two options. It turns out that Hank is a Survivor. However, Hank has a very Guardian-esque ability in that he can be assigned damage and horror dealt to ally assets or other investigators at your location. So it would make sense that Hank has access to Guardian cards in some fashion. Now, I suspect that Hank Sampson is Daniela's mirror in that he has access to level 0 Survivor cards, 5 Guardian cards level 0, and then Guardian cards level 1 to 5. There's a lot of compelling evidence just based on sort of the cards that have been spoiled for the Survivor class so far, as well as some of the cards that Hank has, that he will have access to the Guardian card pool in some fashion, and him being Daniela's mirror would make a lot of sense. There are a couple of reasons that I could see the designers going a different direction, however. One is that there are already a lot of Guardian/Survivor investigators in the game. Of course, there's Daniela, who starts off as a Guardian and then transforms into a Survivor. You've got Tommy Muldoon, who is a Guardian who can take level 0 to 2 Survivor cards. You've got his mirror, William Yorick, who can take level 0 to 2 Guardian cards. And the designers recently released the parallel version of Ashcan Pete, and his deck building options include 5 level 0 Guardian cards. So there's already a lot of Guardian/Survivor investigators out there. So the designers may want to do something different with Hank and not make him Daniela's mirror. The other reason Hank may not end up being a perfect mirror of Daniela is that the Warden version of Hank, which we will look at in a moment, is awfully similar to Mark Harrigan. So I'm not too sure whether the designers will want to duplicate Mark with Hank. So they may go a different direction there, but once Hank is defeated, you get to choose one of his 2 bonded versions. The first is Hank Sampson, Warden. The Warden version has 4 willpower, 1 intellect, 6 combat, and 3 agility. He has the Warden and Resolute trait bonded to Hank Sampson. You cannot be healed. You may be assigned damage and or horror dealt to ally assets and other investigators at your location. As a reaction, when 1 or more damage is placed on you, you gain 2 resources. And his Elder Sign effect is +1, move 1 damage from Hank Sampson to an asset you control, and he has 6 health and 4 sanity. Obviously, with 6 combat, Hank has the highest combat skill in the game and will be an absolute monster when dealing with enemies. If he can take some big weapons, including the big Guardian weapons, he is going to be a force to be reckoned with in combat. Unfortunately, that is paired with the lowest sanity in the game. All the other investigators have at least 5 sanity. Hank has only 4, but at least he has a 4 willpower to compensate for that. So he does have some protection from the encounter deck. Still, he is only 1 bad rotting remains from going down to 1 sanity or just dying outright. So you are going to need to take care to protect Hank's sanity. Probably need to include at least guts, if not I think it's Say Your Prayers is the desperate skill version of guts that gives you 4 willpower skill icons. So you are going to need to definitely protect Hank's sanity. Now, much like Mark Harrigan, Hank is incentivized to take damage. Mark, if he takes damage, gets to draw a card. If Hank takes damage, he gets to generate 2 resources, which again sort of lends credence to the idea that he will be part Guardian. Guardians need a lot of resources to pay for all of their expensive assets and toys, so it would make sense that if Hank does take Guardian cards level 1 to 5, that he would need some way to generate the extra resources to pay for all of that stuff, as well as probably some sanity soak to boot. So then again, this ability is very similar to Mark Harrigan. So are the designers going to create a carbon copy of Mark Harrigan? Maybe yes, maybe no. We'll have to wait and see. Now, it's worth noting here that Hank cannot be healed, but he can move damage from himself to other assets that he controls. So he's not healing per se. Of course, it is an Elder Sign ability, so it's not something you can necessarily rely on. He can also only heal damage on himself. He cannot move horror to other cards, which, again, you're going to need to pack the soak in order to deal with that, or just make sure you never fail a willpower test, which, of course, given the fact that there's an auto-fail in the bag, is not something you can guarantee. So, given the fact that the Warden version of Hank Sampson has 6 health and 4 sanity, makes upgrades like Jessica Hyde and Peter Sylvester really seem like no-brainers in a Hank deck, which really makes me think that his deck building options are going to lock him out of Survivor cards level 1+, if only to force players to think outside the box. If you're building a Hank deck, it would be very, very tempting to reach for an ally like Jessica Hyde, who boosts his combat to 7 and also gives him a way of sort of just perpetually healing damage. So I suspect that the designers are going to take away that low-hanging fruit from players and force them to look at some of the other cards in the game. That said, if Hank can take Guardian cards at level 1 to 5, there is an ally like Garish Kadakia 4, who is somewhat similar to Jessica and Peter. Garish has 3 health and 3 sanity. Garish can give you +2 on any skill test, and if you succeed, you get to remove a damage and horror from him. So that would be one way of helping Hank deal with his sort of fragile health and sanity. Garish could take a horror for Hank. Hank takes a skill test, passes it, and then Garish heals that horror, and away you go. So Garish is very similar to Jessica and Peter, but he sort of takes a little bit more work You do still have to pass skill tests. So Garish isn't necessarily the easy fix that Peter or Jessica would be. So again, I think given that either Jessica or Peter would just be sort of the obvious choice for Hank to take, I suspect he will not have access to them, in which case an ally like Garish is a definite alternative. The other version of Hank's bonded card is Hank Sampson, the Assistant. It is a much more balanced stat line. He has 3 willpower, 3 intellect, 4 combat, and 4 agility, the Assistant and Resolute trait. Bonded Hank Sampson. You cannot be healed. You may be assigned damage and or horror dealt to ally assets or other investigators at your location. As a response, when 1 or more horror is placed on you, draw 1 card. His Elder Sign effect is +1. Move 1 horror from Hank Sampson to an asset you control. And this version of Hank has 4 health and 6 sanity. So it is a much more balanced stat line, which enables Hank to play a variety of roles in a multiplayer setting. It's also a much more friendly solo stat line. If you're building a solo deck for the basic version of Hank, you've really got to work around that 1 intellect. If Hank has 3 intellect, it's a much different story and takes a little bit of pressure off you there, and you can sort of explore other deck ideas with Hank rather than commit so many card slots to simply discovering clues. Now, once again, Hank cannot be healed of horror, but he can move it from himself to another asset he controls if he draws an Elder Sign. That's why sort of Peter is so obvious. If Hank draws an Elder Sign, he could move a horror from himself to Peter, and then Peter automatically heals that horror. If Hank doesn't have access to Peter, you can sort of do the same thing with Garish. He draws an Elder Sign, moves it to Garish, then takes a skill test. If you're successful, Garish can heal that horror. So Garish requires a little bit of extra work than either Peter or Jessica, which sort of makes me suspect that Hank will have access to Guardian cards. Now, Hank's health is very precarious. Again, the lowest health total in the game. So you are going to need to plaque plenty of soak, at least a leather coat to help him out. There are also Guardian cards like Hunter Armor. If you can take that, you could say put in 2 copies of Hunter's Armor and boost both the health and sanity of the Hunter's Armor, so you've got 4 apiece. And then pick up that the upgrade that turns it into an arcane slot, I believe. So you could add 2 copies of Hunter's Armor on the table. That would give Hank plenty of soak. One of the reasons I think that Hank may be a Guardian level 1 to 5 is that cards such as Dodge 2 and Shield of Faith 2 also look like pretty viable options in that deck. Both of those cards cancel attacks, so they don't heal Hank, but they do cancel attacks and prevent him from taking damage. Hank does have 4 agility, so he could feasibly pass the skill test on Dodge 2 to deal a damage back to the enemy, which Hank would obviously like to do. And Shield of Faith plays into the Bless and Curse mechanic, which is one of the themes of this set, and thematically anyway, a Hank Bless deck makes a lot of sense. He could be sort of that Bible-thumping farmhand who goes all in on blessings. As long as you can fill the Chaos Bag with Bless tokens, I think a card like Shield of Faith would make a lot of sense in Hank, so he could cancel attacks, which would prevent him from taking damage, and thus he wouldn't have to heal it, which he can't do anyway. However, like I said, this version of Hank Sampson is quite similar to Mark Harrigan. Mark Harrigan takes a damage and draws a card. Hank Sampson takes a horror to draw a card. So I'm not entirely certain the designers will make Hank a Guardian level 1 to 5. I think there's a lot of evidence that they will, but whether they want an investigator who is so similar to Mark is open to question. Hank's signature event is Stout-Hearted. It's a 2-cost event with willpower combat and a wild skill icon. The Spirit trait, Hamp Sampson deck only. Fast, play when you engage a non-elite enemy, move up to 2 damage and or horror from Hank Samson to that enemy as damage. So Stout-Hearted gives Hank yet another way besides his Elder Sign ability to quote-unquote heal himself while killing an enemy at the same time. Hank's signature event does incentivize him to take damage and horror, just not too much. So you do want some damage and horror on Hank, so when you do draw Stout-Hearted, you can move it. But of course, you need to walk that fine line if you've only got 4 health or 4 sanity. Now, if the horror counts as damage too, there aren't many enemies that are going to survive taking 4 damage. So this could, if the horror does count as damage as well, then Hank can take out some pretty big beasties if he plays Stout-Hearted while removing damage and horror from himself to boot. So obviously this card really plays nicely with what Hank is trying to do. Now, if Hank can only take 5 Guardian level cards, level 0, and Guardian cards level 1 to 5, either level of Boxing Gloves can tutor Stout-Hearted. Again, more evidence that he may have access to some level of Guardian cards. I mean, just look at the art. Hank's in a boxing pose. Boxing Gloves would fit pretty well in his deck. And then, of course, you can use the Boxing Gloves to search for a spirit-traded event, which Stout-Hearted is. And then Hank could take that into his hand and then use that to heal, quote-unquote heal, some of the damage and horror on him. Boxing Gloves also fetches cards like I've Had Worse level 2, which cancels damage and horror in exchange for resources, which a Guardian version of Hank would really like. It also can grab Sweeping Kick level 1, which could leverage Hank's average to above average agility. So there are spirit cards besides Stout-Hearted that would work very well in a Guardian version of Hank Samson. The more I look at the card pool, the more I suspect that Hank is part Guardian in some way, but we'll have to wait and see. Hank's signature weakness is Where's Paw? It has the flaw trait, Revelation, discard cards from the top of the encounter deck until an enemy is discarded. Attach Where's Paw to that enemy and spawn it at a connecting location if able. The attached enemy gains Elusive. Forced at the end of the round, Hank Samson takes 1 direct horror. So this card really goes to show how much sort of design philosophy has changed over the course of the game's lifespan. As you're probably well aware, this is very similar to Zoe Samers's basic weakness, and that weakness will pulls an enemy out of the encounter deck and then sends it all the way across the map to the farthest location. This one does something very similar, but drops it at a connecting location, and there's, I think, a pretty good reason for that. Direct horror is no joke in Hank Samson. It's very bad news, especially if you're playing the Warden version of Hank and you only have 4 sanity to work with. Of course, you cannot soak direct horror on allies or other assets, so you are going to have to act very fast in order to deal with the enemy to which Where's Paw is attached, or unfortunately Hank is going to be defeated very quickly. Of course, that begs the question, what is the elusive keyword? I suspect the elusive keyword is a new mechanic that will be introduced in the Feast of Hemlock Vale campaign expansion. Now, we've seen keywords like retaliate and alert before, but not elusive. However, elusive has appeared before in the Arkham horror board game. Monsters in that game with the elusive ability try to avoid combat with investigators instead of initiating it. And if an investigator in that game wants to initiate combat with an elusive monster, the investigator must be in the same area during the movement phase and must first pass an evade check. I suspect elusive is going to work fairly similarly in the Arkham Horror LCG, If you pull an enemy from the encounter deck, attach Where's Paw to it, and place it at a connecting location, Hank will have to go to that location and possibly pass an agility skill test in order to engage that enemy. That would make the most sense to me, and then he could kill it from there. That would also explain why Hank has sort of average to above average agility in all of his versions. If Hank didn't have the agility to pass an evade skill test, dealing with a card like Where's Paw would be pretty difficult if that's how elusive works. So at least Hank has 3 or 4 agility depending on the version you play with, so that if you do have to pass an evade test in order to engage an enemy with the elusive keyword, he has a pretty good chance of that. And then of course, if Hank is part Guardian, he will have no problem killing that enemy, so he can mitigate the potential danger of Where's Paw that way. But man, oh man, if you don't act quickly on this one, it will definitely take down the Warden version of Hank very, very quickly. That's going to do it for my look at the Hank Sampson Investigator card that will be released in the Feast of Hemlock Vale Investigator expansion in January. This video was running awfully long, so I decided that I would take a look at the Survivor cards that were spoiled during the live stream in a separate video. Look for that one soon. Really looking forward to getting my hands on Hank. Personally, I think I'll be leaning towards the assistant version of Hank, which has a little bit more of a balanced stat line and has the 3 intellect, so I don't have to commit so much of my deck to working around his 1 intellect, which can get kind of tiresome in when you're playing low intellect survivors. There are enough tools in the survivor and neutral card pools that you can discover clues if necessary, but it is somewhat restrictive, so I'm looking forward to that. And of course, if you're playing multiplayer and you just want to kill bosses, then you have the Warden version of Hank, who just hits awfully hard. We don't know Hank's deck building options, but I think it's pretty clear that he will have some sort of access to Guardian cards. The designers may throw us a curveball and give Hank access to something else, but Guardian just fits with his ability, it fits with what he wants to do, and there are a lot of interesting combos in there that you could put in a Hank Sampson deck if he does have access to Guardian cards 1 to 5. So I really think that Hank's going to be is going to be Daniela's mirror. That's going to do it. If you enjoy this type of content, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'm going to be back soon. I think I'm going to build a Kate deck and sort of roughly approximate what her deck building options are, and we may take her for a spin. So stay tuned for that. I also owe everybody a Parallel Pete playthrough, which I'm looking forward to bringing you. Hope you're having a great day, and thanks again for your support. Take care. That's going to do it for this episode. If you enjoyed what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromlang@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromlang. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.